In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon His last and beloved Messenger Muhammad, and may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all. The title of this lecture is Explanation of verse number 7 of chapter 51 of the Noble Qur'an. And in this verse Allah Almighty states the following: and the heaven containing weaved ropes. Now, if we ponder and reflect upon this verse, because the key to understand the Noble Qur'an is to ponder and reflect upon the verses and not just merely reciting them. Allah Almighty states here that the heaven contains weaved ropes. Now the heaven mentioned in the Noble Qur'an, it's any volume surrounding a central object. For example, the volume surrounding the earth is called the heaven of the earth. The volume surrounding the nucleus of the atom is called the heaven of the atom. So Allah Almighty states here that the heaven, any heaven, contains weaved ropes, a fabric made of weaved ropes. Now let's take this further. If we think about the heaven, sky, we see that it's composed of two main things. Firstly, matter and energy. So the heaven, sky, is composed, let's take for example the sky of the earth, is composed of two components, matter and energy. And since Allah Almighty states that it contains weaved ropes, this means that energy and matter should be composed of a fabric made of weaved strings or weaved ropes. So let's start with energy. From the Noble Qur'an, the last revelation of Allah God to people, we can conclude that the basic unit of energy is three strings, three ropes weaved together to produce the shape you see. So this is the basic unit of energy from the Noble Qur'an, three strings weaved together. Also we can conclude and deduce from the Noble Qur'an that these three strings are vibrating. They're not static, they're dynamic. Because Allah states in the Noble Qur'an that it vibrates and it grows. Allah linked growth and life to vibration. An object needs to vibrate to be alive. So these three strings are vibrating, and due to their vibration they produce a magnetic field, the electromagnetic field, such that each unit becomes like a small magnet having a north and a south pole. And such, for example, if we try to arrange three magnets, we see that the configuration, the best stable configuration, is an equilateral triangle. A triangle which is equal on all sides. Because the repulsion between the three magnets would be equal in that configuration. So we have a triangle. And since energy is composed of billions of these units, so triangles with each other, they form a hexagonal shape. So we can learn from the Noble Qur'an that energy, the basic units of energy, are arranged in a hexagonal pattern, both lengthwise and widthwise. In a horizontal and vertical arrangement, the weaved ropes of energy, they are arranged in a hexagonal pattern. So we see that the truthfulness of the statement of Allah God Almighty, that energy and the heaven is composed of weaved ropes. So these weaved ropes, they produce a fabric. It's like a fabric of energy composed of these weaved ropes. And this shows also the superiority of the Noble Qur'an, because till this day no one knows the shape of the basic unit of energy. But this is from the Noble Qur'an, which shows the superiority of the Noble Qur'an to the main theme of the people of this age, which is knowledge. And Allah Almighty shows us this. so that the believer would be the teacher of others and not the one on the receiving end, and would attract people to the Noble Quran, to the guidance of Allah the Almighty there. That would attract people and would be a way for them to be guided to the path of the Almighty, because Allah the Almighty wants mercy for people and not their torment. Now let's take this further as well. Also we can learn from the Noble Quran that Allah the Almighty created everything, has made everything from water. What does this mean? This means that Allah the Almighty designed creation based on the same design of water. For example, in regards of energy, if you drop a rock in a pond of water, we see that energy propagates from the source with concentric circles. So if you drop a rock in a pond of water, you see that the energy propagates from the source, from a place you drop the rock, with concentric circles. And if you take this to three-dimensional space, you see that's composed of concentric spheres. So energy propagates from the source with concentric spheres. So we can learn from the Noble Quran that these weave drops of energy, they should propagate from an energy source, like for example light or gravitational source, with concentric spheres having a hexagonal arrangement. And if we compare this conclusion from experimental findings, we see a perfect match between the deductions from the Noble Quran, the conclusions of the Noble Quran, and experimental findings. Also, this hexagonal pattern of arrangement, we see it also from experimental findings. For example, photons, when you see their pattern of photons, the basic unit of energy for light, you see that they are arranged in a hexagonal pattern, exactly as deduced from the Noble Quran. Also we can learn another fact from this Quranic verse and the heaven containing weave drops, is that since Allah the Almighty states that the basic unit of energy is a rope, and the main characteristic of a rope is to produce a pulling action, tension between its two ends. So this means that all forms of energy, they have a pulling action and tension between the source and the sink. If we take this to gravitational energy, this is exactly true. When you are standing on the earth, since the earth is the source of gravitational energy, you feel a pulling action on your body. And this can best be described by having weaved ropes pulling you downwards. So you are in this fabric of weaved ropes, and they are affecting you by pulling you downwards. So you see, brothers and sisters, the knowledge contained in each and every word of the Noble Quran. And no human can produce something like this. No human can produce a book in which in every word there is this kind of so much knowledge. No human can do that. Now this is with regards to energy, and we saw how it's composed of weaved of a fabric, exactly like Allah states in the Quran. Now taking this to matter, examining matter in the heaven. Now the matter in the sky is composed, for example, of air atoms, water vapor. Now if we think about a single atom, an atom has a nucleus and a heavens and 7 layers or 7 heavens surrounding it. Now since Allah states that any heaven would contain weaved ropes, this means that the heaven of the atom would contain weaved ropes. And these weaved ropes, they produce a pulling action, a gravitational pull on their ends. So if two atoms are brought in close proximity to each other, the weaved ropes of the first atom would attract the other. It's like putting two planets in close proximity to each other. So they would attract each other. So the two atoms would attract each other, and an atomic bond is created. So we can learn from the Noble Quran that atomic bonding is created by the gravitational pull on each atom. They pull each other, and thus there is a link between the two atoms. Now, also, each atom has a nucleus, and this nucleus, it rotates, and due to its rotation it produces an electromagnetic field. So each nucleus has a north and a south pole, and thus if three nuclei were brought in close proximity, they will arrange themselves. Allah Almighty placed this mechanism that they will arrange themselves in a triangular fashion. They will be like a triangle, and triangles with each other, they produce a hexagonal shape. So we can conclude from the Qur'an that atoms are arranged in a hexagonal pattern, and this is proven from experimental findings. So we see that also matter in the heaven is composed of fabric of atoms, and these atoms, they have weaved ropes linking them together, so it's a fabric, exactly as stated in the Qur'an. Now we can explain from this the phenomenon of cloud formation. We can explain from this the phenomenon of cloud formation. How is this so? Let's examine water. Now suppose that we are looking at water in a liquid state. We see that there is a central atom taking one hexagonal cell of water atoms. There is a central atom surrounded by 6 atoms. Now what is the weight of the central atom? Now we have an atom in the middle surrounded by 6 atoms, and you want to know what is the weight, the gravitational pull of the earth on this central atom. Now it's the weight of the central atom is there, it's always there. Now due to the linking of the 6 surrounding atoms to the central one, we have the central atom would feel the part of the weight of the surrounding atoms. Once again, due to the linking by these gravity weaved ropes of the central atom to the surrounding 6 atoms, the central atom would feel part of the weight of the surrounding 6 atoms. Now suppose that the central atom sees 1/6 of the weaved ropes of the surrounding atoms. Thus, its effective weight would be its own weight plus 1/6 multiplied by 6 atoms, which is 1. So its effective weight would be 2. So the central atom is like it's heavier due to the linking of the surrounding atoms, and thus we can explain why liquid water is on the earth. It's not in the sky, because it's the atoms are heavier due to their linking, and thus they are touching the earth, and they tend to go downward. Now what happens when sunlight hits water, seas and oceans? Now sunlight is electromagnetic energy. What happens is that it excites, it gives more energy to the electrons, so they vibrate more and they produce a higher magnetic field, and thus each atom would have a higher magnetic energy, like a stronger magnet. Each atom would become a stronger magnet, and thus there is more repulsion between the atoms within the fabric, the hexagonal fabric. This increased repulsion would drive the atoms further away from each other, and this repulsion would tear some of the linking gravity weaved ropes between the atoms, and thus the central atom would become lighter. Why? Because the weight it sees from the surrounding atoms is less now. Suppose that now it sees 1/8 of the atom of the surrounding atoms, and thus its weight would become 1 plus 6/8 from the weight of the surrounding atoms, become lighter. And thus we see that water vapor, it goes upward. That explains why hot gases, they tend to go upward, because due to this kind of repulsion, increased magnetic repulsion, the distances between the atoms becomes larger, and thus the atoms become lighter, and they elevate and they go upward. Now, as the water vapor goes upward, it cools down. It cools down, and when it cools down, what happens is that energy now is removed from the electrons, meaning their vibration becomes less, and thus the gravitational, the magnetic repulsion between the atoms becomes less, and thus the atoms are becoming closer to each other. So the atoms, they will become closer, and as they become closer, the central atom would see more from the weight of the surrounding atoms due to the linking gravity wave ropes, and thus it becomes heavier. The atoms, they become heavier, and they stop on a certain elevation. So that's the reason we see clouds, because they're kind of lowering in temperature. The atoms become heavier, and thus they stop rising. They stop rising. So we see that water vapor, when it's hot, it rises upward, and then when it cools down, it becomes heavier, and thus the clouds are hanged in the sky. Now, why the atoms, when they become lighter, they rise up, they elevate? The reason why is that since the earth is rotating, so when the atoms become lighter, due to the centrifugal force, they tend to rise. They tend to go upward. Once again, due to the rotation of the earth, there is centrifugal force acting on the atoms. So when they become lighter, they are driven farther away from the earth. And as they become heavier, they are there is kind of stability, a balance that is occurred between the weight of the atoms and the centrifugal force acting on them. Also, we can learn from this that when this fabric of atoms, that the atoms, they are at a distance from each other, then light can penetrate more, and that's the reason why water vapor is not seen that much, because the distance between the atoms, they are at a distance, and thus light can penetrate from that fabric. But when water becomes colder, the atoms, they are brought closer to each other, and thus light is absorbed more in the atoms, and thus you can see clouds. So this explains why you cannot see that much water vapor when it's hot, but you can see clouds more, because when they are close to each other, they absorb more of the sunlight, and thus you can see them. And so you see, brothers and sisters, the knowledge that can be learned from the Noble Qur'an, and the mercy of Allah God Almighty unto people in showing them this to be as a way for them to be guided to the path of Allah God Almighty. And to know more details about this topic, please visit my website at www.quran-miracle.com. That's www.quran-mircle.com, and you can email me at zaidquran@yahoo.com. And may the peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all.